So many of you have been sending in this Ray Dalio piece on tariffs, and, it's really got people talking.
Yeah, for sure.
But the thing that kind of jumped out at me right away was, well, he makes this point that getting hung up on tariffs.
Great.
It's like trying to understand a hurricane just by looking at a couple of raindrops. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. You're missing the whole system.
Totally. Like you're missing this massive swirling system that's actually creating those raindrops.
Exactly.
And I think that's what Dalio was getting at.
Yeah, he's pushing us to look beyond just the surface.
Right.
Tariffs are a symptom,
Uh-huh.
but they're not the root cause.
Exactly. So our mission, if you will, with this deep dive isn't to just get stuck in the weeds of trade wars and tariffs,
Yeah.
but to really try to wrap our heads around these larger forces that Dalio sees as driving them.
Yeah, and I think he's got a pretty interesting perspective on that.
He does.
Okay.
And I think it's worth taking a moment to just acknowledge that Dalio has this long history of really understanding and observing these economic and historical cycles. Right?
Yeah, definitely.
It's not just like reacting to the latest headlines.
No.
He's looking at the long game,
Right, the underlying trends.
the long-term trends.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when he says something like, we're witnessing a, quote, classic breakdown of the major monetary, political, and geopolitical orders.
That's a pretty big statement.
That's a pretty big statement.
Well,
It makes you kind of sit up and take notice, right?
yeah, I mean, he's basically saying this is a once-in-a-lifetime kind of shift.
Wow.
And it has happened before, but,
Oh, interesting.
not very often.
Okay, so let's break this down because there's a lot to unpack here.
Mhm.
Let's start with the monetary and economic order.
Yeah.
When Dalio says that's breaking down, what does he actually mean?
Well, I think the key thing for him is this unsustainable level of debt. Global debt. Global debt, yeah.
Okay.
And how fast it's growing.
It just keeps going up.
Keeps going up, yeah. And he talks about this imbalance, right? You have these debtor nations, like the U.S.,
Mhm.
who are borrowing a ton of money to spend more than they're taking in.
Right.
And then on the other side, you have the creditor nations,
Like China?
like China,
Oh, yeah?
who depend on selling their goods to those debtor nations to keep their own economies humming.
So they need each other.
Exactly. And that's where the tension comes in.
I see. Okay.
Because, if you're a debtor nation, you start to worry, well, what if those creditor nations suddenly cut us off?
Right. Like we need that stuff.
Right.
And what if they're not happy with, the way things are going?
Exactly. And on the flip side, the creditor nations are thinking, well, what if these debtor nations can't actually pay us back?
Oh, that's a good point. So it creates this kind of mutual vulnerability.
Exactly.
Okay. And then, thinking about this idea of deglobalization, which he touches on, this idea that, maybe the world isn't going to be as interconnected as it has been.
Right. Less trade, more.
More going it alone.
Yeah, looking out for yourself.
Right. And if that's the trend, does this debt situation, get even more problematic?
Well, it certainly throws a wrench in things.
Yeah.
I mean, if countries are less willing to rely on each other, those trade and capital imbalances that we talked about,
Hey.
they become even more risky.
It's interesting because, you think about, the U.S. economy over the past several decades, we've seen this huge decline in manufacturing, right?
Right. A lot of jobs have gone overseas.
Yeah, exactly. And we've become increasingly reliant on imports for all sorts of things, even essential goods. And so now, if we're entering this period of deglobalization and distrust, does that, make us more vulnerable?
Well, it's certainly a point of concern.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're relying on another country for, say, critical medical supplies and relations start to sour,
Right.
that puts you in a pretty precarious position.
And it's not just medical supplies, right? It could be, components for technology or...
Anything, really.
Yeah.
And, when it comes to the U.S. specifically, Dalio is really worried about the level of government debt.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Huge.
He even references his own book, How Countries Go Broke.
He does. And the point he makes is that the amount of debt the U.S. government has right now and the rate at which it's growing is just not sustainable.
Okay. So we've got this huge debt burden.
Yep.
We've got this potential shift towards deglobalization.
Uh-huh.
And we've got this dependence on other countries for essential stuff.
Yeah, not exactly a recipe for stability.
No,
Oh.
not at all. And Dalio's point is that these changes, these shifts, they're not something that might happen in the future.
They're happening now.
They're happening now.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to the domestic political order. What's breaking down there, according to Dalio?
Well, he sees these growing divides within society.
Okay.
Big disparities in things like education, opportunities, productivity, income, wealth,
Yeah.
even values.
So people are further and further apart in terms of like their experiences and their beliefs.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. And he argues that the current political system just isn't equipped to deal with these kinds of deep-seated problems.
And that's what's leading to all this polarization.
Yeah, that's part of it. I mean, when people feel like the system isn't working for them, they get frustrated.
Yeah.
And then you see these kind of win-at-all-costs fights between, as he puts it, populists on the right and left.
And he specifically calls out populism, huh?
He does. And, populism, it can be a powerful force.
Right.
It often taps into this idea that the, quote, common person is being ignored or exploited by the elites.
Mm-hmm.
And that can resonate with a lot of people.
Yeah, it definitely can. And is he saying that, like, populism itself is a problem?
Well, I think his concern is that when it becomes too extreme, too focused on just gaining and holding on to power, it can undermine the very principles that democracy is built on.
Like compromise.
Yeah, compromise, a willingness to listen to different points of view, respect for the rule of law,
Okay.
all that stuff.
So when these things start to erode, when those principles start to weaken, what happens?
Well, historically, that's when you see the rise of autocratic leaders.
Wow.
Strong men who promise to fix everything, but who often end up concentrating power in their own hands.
And that kind of like feeds back into the economic problems.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when you have political instability, it can make it really hard to address economic challenges effectively.
Right. So it becomes this vicious cycle.
Exactly.
Okay. So we've talked about the monetary and economic order breaking down. We've talked about the domestic political order breaking down. What about the international geopolitical world order? What's happening there?
So Dalio argues that for a long time, the world order has been dominated by the U.S., right?
Right, as the superpower.
The superpower. And they've been sort of the main player shaping the rules of the game.
Right, like the referee.
Exactly.
Okay.
But what he's saying is that that era is coming to an end.
Interesting. So what's replacing it?
Well, he thinks we're moving towards a more kind of might makes right world.
Or power juice.
Power rules.
Okay.
Okay.
And so, like, the trade war is part of that.
That's one example.
Okay.
But there are others. You see it in the growing geopolitical tensions, the competition over technology,
Okay.
even the military conflicts that are happening around the world.
So it's this shift from a, like, more cooperative, rule-based system to a system where it's more about...
Who has the clout?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And he ties this into the America First approach.
He does. And I think what he's getting at is that the U.S., under this new approach, is less interested in being the global referee and more interested in, putting their own interests first.
Right. Like looking out for number one.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've got these three major breakdowns, these orders that are in flux. And then he adds in two more forces that are increasingly disrupting things.
Yeah.
Acts of nature and technological changes.
Right. So on the one hand, you've got these things like droughts, floods, pandemics, which are becoming more frequent and more intense.
Yeah, we've definitely seen that.
And on the other hand, you have these incredible technological advancements, particularly in artificial intelligence.
AI.
AI, exactly. And that's having a huge impact on everything from the economy to politics to the way we fight wars.
It's changing the game entirely.
It is.
And Dalio's big point here, the thing he really wants us to understand, is that these five forces, these breakdowns, they're not happening in isolation, are they?
No, not at all. They're all intertwined. They're feeding off each other.
And he uses the example of tariffs to illustrate this interconnectedness.
Right. So let's take tariffs. On the surface, they seem like a pretty straightforward economic policy, right? But Dalio argues that they actually have ripple effects across all five of these orders.
Okay, I'm curious. Walk me through it.
Sure. So economically, tariffs obviously disrupt trade flows and markets.
Right, they make things more expensive.
Exactly, and that can lead to all sorts of unintended consequences. But then domestically, tariffs can also be politically disruptive.
Also.
Well, they can alienate certain groups.
Okay.
Maybe some businesses or consumers who rely on those imported goods.
Right, they're not happy with higher prices.
Exactly. And then on the international stage, tariffs can really damage relationships between countries.
Like starting trade wars.
Yeah, it creates mistrust and animosity. And then, even in areas like climate change, tariffs can make it harder for countries to cooperate on solutions.
Okay.
And finally, with technology, the impact of tariffs is kind of a mixed bag.
Meaning?
Well, on the one hand, They can incentivize some companies to bring production back home.
Oh, interesting.
But on the other hand, they can also hurt the capital markets that are needed to fund innovation.
Right.
So it's a very complex picture.
It is, and I think it's so easy to get caught up in, like, the day-to-day news cycle.
Right.
And miss these bigger, more fundamental shifts that are happening.
Absolutely.
And, what's interesting to me is that Dalio frames all of this, all these breakdowns, as a kind of historical echo.
Yeah, he's big on historical cycles.
He is, and he's saying that we've seen this kind of thing before.
Many times, actually.
Oh.
He argues that these breakdowns, these shifts in power, they tend to happen when you have similar underlying conditions.
So what he's saying is, don't freak out. This isn't totally unprecedented.
Yeah, I think he's trying to provide some context,
Right.
some perspective. He's saying, look, we can learn from the past.
Yeah.
He even suggests studying how policymakers responded to similar situations in the past.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, he talks about things like suspending debt payments.
Whoa, that's a big one.
It is. Or establishing capital controls, or imposing special taxes.
Things that seem pretty radical today.
They do, right. But they were used in the past, and he thinks they might be on the table again.
Interesting.
And, he even has a whole framework for understanding these big historical cycles. It's laid out in his book, Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order.
And in that book, he talks about this overall big cycle with 6 stages.
He does. And by looking at those stages, we can kind of get a sense of where we are in the current cycle.
Oh, that's fascinating. And is he trying to, predict the future with this?
Not exactly. I think he's more interested in, helping us understand the possibilities.
Right. The potential paths that things could take.
Exactly.
Okay, so why is Dalio sharing all of this? What's his goal?
Well, I think there are a few things he's hoping to achieve.
Okay.
First, I think he genuinely wants to help policymakers.
Makes sense.
He wants them to understand these forces, these breakdowns, so they can make better decisions.
Okay.
And hopefully, steer us towards a better outcome.
Right.
But it's not just about policymakers. He also wants to empower individuals to understand what's happening in the world and how it might affect their lives.
So we can make better decisions for ourselves.
Exactly. And finally, I think he really believes in the power of open dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
He wants people to talk about these issues, to share different perspectives.
Right, to have these conversations.
Exactly, because he believes that's how we get closer to the truth.
And figure out the best way forward.
Yeah.
It's worth noting, though, that Dalio is very clear that these are his personal views.
Right.
Not necessarily the views of his firm.
Exactly.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, I think the key takeaway for you, the listener, is this.
Right.
Don't get so caught up in the headlines about tariffs that you miss the bigger picture.
Yeah. There's a lot more going on beneath the surface.
There is. There are these huge fundamental shifts happening in our world, in the monetary system, in the political landscape, in the geopolitical order.
Right.
And these shifts are driven by these 5 interconnected forces that Dalio lays out. The debt, the political division, the changing balance of power, the disruptions from nature, and the incredible power of technology.
It's a lot to take in.
It is, but it's important stuff. And so as you go about your day, I'd encourage you to think about these 5 forces.
Yeah.
Which ones do you think will have the biggest impact on your life?
And on the world around us.
Exactly. And then, maybe do a little digging into history.
Yeah. See if there are any parallels, any lessons we can learn from the past.
Because as Dalio reminds us, this isn't the first time we face these kinds of challenges.
And it probably won't be the last.
And it probably won't be the last. So
Yeah.
think about those connections, those interrelationships.
Right, because what seems like an isolated event today might actually be part of a much larger cycle.
Exactly. A cycle that's been playing out for centuries.
And will likely continue to play out.
And will likely continue to play out
For a long time to come.
for a long time to come.
And on that note.
We'll leave you to ponder.
Exactly.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Until next time.